All right, hey, what's up, legends? It's Mr. Cherry, and I am here to help you describe a graph. Now, obviously, what you're seeing here is not a graph, but what I want you to think about is that when an author, so somebody who writes a book, when they write their words, what they're trying to do is they're trying to create a picture in your mind. And so I'm showing you this image today to remind you of a book that you may or may not have read yet in ninth grade. It's called Of Mice and Men. And I'm going to read a quote by John Steinbeck, the author. And he said this: "A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and green. The water is warm, too, for it has slipped twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool." So as you can see in Steinbeck's words, he paints a picture of this scene. And so what we're going to learn about today is how we can use words to paint the picture of a graph. Ladies and gentlemen, like any good author, we need to make sure that we have our vocabulary in place in order to describe a graph properly. And so what I'm going to give you here is a list of some things that we want to think about when we describe a graph. So the first thing we start with is we want to think about what is the shape of the graph. And so that's kind of a basic thing in terms of what does it look like. We want to relate it to something we've seen before. The next thing is in a graph, surprisingly, there's actually a lot of key features. And so what we call them sometimes is we call them special points. And so here are some special points that we're going to be focusing on in Algebra 1 this year. So we're going to be talking about the y-intercept. And that represents where the graph crosses the y-axis. We're going to be talking about the x-intercept. And that is where a graph crosses the x-axis. And finally, we might say some other words such as maximum or minimum. And those would be kind of where a graph might have a highest or a lowest point. Finally, the last thing that we're going to describe is what we call the direction. So meaning, what is happening to y as x increases. So just like when you read Of Mice and Men, you read from left to right, the same is true when we are evaluating a graph. We always start at the left side and read it towards the right side. So if you need to, pause the video, go back, rewatch these ways that we can describe a graph. And coming up, I'm going to show you an example of how I describe a graph. Here's our first example, ladies and gentlemen. So we can see that we have the x and y axis here, and we have this nice graph right here, this purple. I guess what I would say in terms of shape is I would call it a line. That's pretty easy to describe. So the shape of this graph is a line. Its key features, we've got this checklist over here that we want to look at. So we could say that this line crosses the y-axis right here at this point. Right? So that point would represent where the line crosses the y-axis. And so that would give us the ordered pair of 0, 3. So as I'm describing this, I could say that this line crosses the y-axis at 0, 3. And I could also say that this line crosses the x-axis at a point as well. So if I look at this line again, I just want to figure out where does it cross the x-axis. And if I look at this, it would cross right here at -3, 0. Now, because this line has arrows on the end, it's going to go forever to the left and down, and it's always going to go forever to the right and up. So this line is not going to have a maximum. It's not going to have a minimum. It's actually going to have neither of them. It doesn't have a max or min. So the final thing is to talk about our direction. So here's what I'd like you to think about. As I start on the left side of this graph and I read it over towards the right, what is happening to the y values? So we would make a statement like this. We would say something like, as x increases, what's happening to y. And so what I notice is, as x is getting bigger, I notice that my y values are also increasing, meaning this line is showing a direction of going up. So I could say as x increases, y increases. So that would be a way that I could describe these key features. So I'm talking about the shape. This is a line. It crossed the y-axis at 0, 3. It had an x-intercept at -3, 0. It did not have a maximum or minimum because of the arrows on the end. And finally, its direction was as x increases, y increases. Some of you might be more familiar with the word. We might say that this has a positive direction because it is going up. So hopefully that first example made sense. So let's take a look at another one, maybe a little bit more complicated. So let's take a look at this next graph. So you can see here that we definitely have a different kind of shape here. It almost looks like it's made up of two lines. In fact, this looks familiar to me. It looks like a letter of our alphabet. So I might say that this graph has a V shape, right? Because that would be really useful in terms of helping somebody draw it. I could see from this graph that it crosses the y-axis right here at 0, 0. So that would be my y-intercept. I can see here that I have an x-intercept also. In fact, if I look at this graph crosses the x-axis in two different spots. So it's going to cross right here at 0, 0. Ooh, I'm going to have to add a second one here. And I can see that this graph also crosses at the point 2, 0. So this one graph has two different x-intercepts. And sometimes that happens. It's okay. But we want to identify both of those key features here. Now, the other thing I noticed is that this point right here seems to be the lowest point that the y values go to. That's as low as it goes. And it seems like it always opens up from here. All right, so what that means is because this is what I would call the lowest point of the graph, that means that we have a minimum in this case. All right, and let's identify where that minimum is. So our minimum is at the point, let's see, it looks like it's at the point 1, -2. All right, so those are kind of some of those key features that I could talk about. Going back to shape really quick, because I just thought of something. What I notice about this is that I could actually draw a vertical line right down the middle of this graph, right? And I could take one side and the other side, and I could fold them on top of each other. So I could also say that it has a V shape and is symmetrical. That's a fancy word, but we might want to add that to our vocabulary. So don't let it trick you. It just means that you can take one half and fold it on top of the other half. So that's what this line right here represents. That's like my mirror line. Now, what's interesting about this is that this graph has two directions. So I've got to be careful how I describe this. So what I might say is something like this. As x increases towards 1, the y values decrease. After x equals 1, what we notice is that those y values actually start to change direction. They start to increase after this point. So if we take a look at how I describe the direction in total, I'm saying this. As x increases, you will notice that y is decreasing until we get to x equals 1. After x equals 1, our y values are increasing. So in our direction here, we're trying to describe that this graph has a change, and that's what gives it that V shape. So now it's your turn to practice. All right, good luck. Watch this video again if you need some extra help.